You did everything right this year. You picked a sunny spot. You bought the healthiest looking seedlings at the nursery. You watered them. You talked to them. Maybe you even hummed a little Willie Nelson while you worked the soil. And then, sometime around July, it happened. The leaves started curling. The bottoms of your tomatoes turned black and mushy. Or worse, you got a jungle of gorgeous green vines and almost no fruit at all. If that sounds familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. It wasn't bad luck. And it probably wasn't a bad plant. In almost 30 years of growing tomatoes in clay soil, in raised beds, in 5-gallon buckets on an apartment balcony, when that's all I had, I've watched the same handful of invisible mistakes wreck harvest after harvest for good, well-meaning gardeners. Mistakes nobody warns you about, because on the surface, they look like the right thing to do. Here's the one that gets me the most calls every August. There's a mistake so many people make in their very first week of planting, weeks before a single flower even shows up, that quietly guarantees a weak, stressed-out plant all season long. And by the time you see the damage, the plant's already made the decision for you. We're going to fix that one, and 6 others, today. Every fix I'm giving you is backed by real plant science, but I promise you, none of it requires a degree in botany. Just a little bit of "oh, that's why." Let's get into it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand your tomato plants in a completely different way, not as a mystery you're at the mercy of, but as a living system that's constantly telling you what it needs, if you just know what to look for. We're covering 7 mistakes today, and I've ordered them on purpose. Each one builds on the last. Mistake 1 happens the day you plant. Mistake 7 is the one that can wipe out an entire healthy crop in 48 hours flat, and it catches even experienced growers off guard. So don't skip ahead. Trust me, mistake number 1 is the quiet one. It's the one nobody talks about because the plant doesn't even show you the damage until months later. Let's start right where every tomato season starts, in the hole you dig on planting day. Mistake 1: planting too shallow. Here's what almost every gardener does on planting day. You dig a hole about the size of the little plastic pot your seedling came in. You drop the plant in so the soil line matches where it was in the container. You pat the dirt down, and you water it in. Feels tidy, feels correct. But that seedling just lost its best shot at a strong root system before it ever had a chance. Here's what eventually happens. That plant grows fine for a few weeks, but come the first heat wave or dry spell of summer, it wilts fast, recovers slow, and never quite catches up to its neighbors. You water it more, and it still struggles. You start to wonder if you got a weak plant from a bad batch. You didn't. You just didn't give it enough roots. Here's the biology, and this is one of those wait, tomatoes can actually do that? Facts. Tomato stems are covered in tiny bumps, little nubs you can feel if you run your finger along a seedling stem. Those are called adventitious root primordia, and under the right conditions, every single one of them can turn into a brand new root. Bury that stem, and instead of one root system, you get root sites stacked all the way up the buried portion of the stem. Most gardeners misunderstand this because we're trained by literally every other plant we've ever grown, houseplants, flowers, shrubs, that burying the stem means rot and death. With tomatoes, it's the opposite. It's an invitation. So here's the fix. Strip the lower leaves off your seedling, leaving just the top set or 2, and bury that plant deep up to 2/3 of the stem underground, sometimes even laying it sideways in a shallow trench if the stem is long and leggy. Every inch of buried stem becomes new root real estate. Do this in USDA zones 5 through 9 once your nighttime soil temperature is consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll notice the difference by mid-June, a plant that shrugs off dry spells instead of collapsing at the first sign of stress. But a deep, strong root system can only do its job if the water actually reaches it the right way, and that brings us to a mistake that looks like the opposite problem, but comes from the exact same root cause. Mistake 2: watering on a schedule. Instead of watching the plant, most of us were taught to water tomatoes deeply, twice a week, or some version of that rule. It sounds responsible. It sounds like exactly what a careful gardener should do. And then, right when your tomatoes start ripening, you get a plant that looks perfectly healthy until the bottom of the fruit turns into a sunken, leathery black patch. You cut into a tomato you were excited about, and half of it is ruined. That's blossom end rot, and here's what almost nobody realizes. It's not a disease. There's no fungus to spray, no bug to blame. It's a calcium delivery problem, and it traces straight back to water. Here's the science. Made simple. Calcium doesn't move through a tomato plant on its own steam. It travels exclusively dissolved in water, riding along as the plant pulls moisture up from the roots. When your watering swings between bone dry and soaking wet, that water flow becomes inconsistent, and the fruit, which is the lowest priority stop on the plant's delivery route, behind the leaves, simply doesn't get enough calcium delivered in time. The tissue at the bottom of the fruit breaks down because the cells physically can't hold their structure without it. Most gardeners misunderstand this because they assume it's a soil nutrient problem. So they go buy a calcium supplement, dump it in, and the rot keeps happening anyway. That's because in the vast majority of garden soils, there's already plenty of calcium present. The problem was never supply. It was delivery. The real fix is boring, but it works. Consistency. Deep, even watering roughly 1 to 1.5 inches per week, delivered steadily rather than in a flood and drought cycle. A 3-inch layer of mulch, whether straw, shredded leaves, or wood chips, does more to prevent blossom end rot than any bottle on the garden center shelf, because it keeps soil moisture from swinging wildly between rainy weeks and dry ones. But here's what surprises most gardeners. How you water isn't just about the roots underground. It's also about what's happening up top, on the leaves, and that mistake is one of the most common reasons entire tomato patches get wiped out by disease. We'll get to that one shortly. First, let's talk about something that happens above ground, in the crowded space between one plant and the next. Mistake 3: planting too close together when those little seedlings go in the ground in May. They're maybe 8 inches tall. So naturally, most gardeners space them close 18 inches, maybe 2 feet apart, because giving them 3 feet of empty dirt between each plant feels wasteful. All that bare soil sitting there doing nothing? Fast forward to late July, and that wasted space argument doesn't look so wasteful anymore. Now you've got a solid wall of tangled tomato foliage, leaves touching leaves, and no matter how much sun is hitting the top of that canopy, the middle and lower parts of the plant stay damp and shaded for hours after every watering or rain. That's exactly the environment fungal spores are waiting for. Here's the plant pathology behind it. Diseases like early blight and septoria leaf spot spread through water, splashing spores from the soil onto lower leaves, and then spore to leaf, leaf to leaf, wherever there's still moisture sitting on the surface. In a properly spaced plant, a breeze and a few hours of sun dry those leaves out before the fungus can establish itself. In a crowded planting, that moisture can sit for the better part of a day. It's basically a greenhouse for disease, except nobody built it on purpose. Most gardeners misunderstand this because the damage doesn't show up in May. When the spacing decision gets made, it shows up 2 months later, and by then, nobody connects a yellowing lower leaf in July to a planting choice from spring. The fix is simple, even if it feels counterintuitive in the moment. Give indeterminate varieties, the tall, vining types like Cherokee Purple or Sun Gold, a full 3 to 4 feet between plants. Give bushier determinate varieties like Roma or Celebrity about 2 to 3 feet. Stake or cage every plant so the foliage grows up, not sideways into its neighbor. That airflow is doing real work you can't see. Now here's where it gets interesting, because even a well-spaced, well-watered plant can still sabotage its own harvest, and this next mistake is one I made myself for years before I understood what was actually happening underground. Mistake 4, overfeeding with nitrogen. This is the mistake that looks the most like success while it's happening, which is exactly why it fools so many gardeners, including me, for years. You feed your tomatoes a general all-purpose fertilizer, or worse, a lawn fertilizer that happens to be sitting in the garage, and the plant responds. Fast, within a couple of weeks you've got thick stems, huge dark green leaves, a plant that looks like it belongs on the cover of a gardening magazine. And then August comes, and you realize you've got the healthiest looking jungle of foliage you've ever grown, and maybe a dozen tomatoes total. Here's the plant biology behind that betrayal. Nitrogen drives vegetative growth. Leaves, stems, that lush green color everyone associates with a healthy plant. But flowering and fruit set are triggered by a different set of resources, primarily phosphorus and potassium, and they require the plant to shift out of pure growth mode into reproduction mode. A tomato plant flooded with nitrogen has no biological reason to make that shift. Why would it slow down and make flowers when it's got everything it needs to just keep growing bigger and greener? Most gardeners misunderstand this because we've been trained that if a little fertilizer helps, more must help more. With nitrogen and tomatoes, that logic breaks down completely. The fix: once your plants are established and starting to flower, switch to a fertilizer specifically formulated for tomatoes, with a lower first number nitrogen and higher phosphorus and potassium, something in a ratio like 5-10-10. Feed roughly every 3 to 4 weeks rather than constantly, and resist the urge to fertilize just because a plant looks like it wants more. A tomato plant that stops getting easy nitrogen almost always responds by putting out flowers instead of foliage within a couple of weeks. But feeding a plant correctly only matters if the plant is actually able to use that energy where it counts, and that leads us into one of the most physically hands-on mistakes on this list. One that involves a part of the tomato plant most beginners don't even know exists. Mistake 5, ignoring suckers. If you've grown tomatoes for more than one season, you've probably noticed little shoots growing in the crook where a branch meets the main stem. Most gardeners leave them alone. They look like just another branch, so why not let the plant grow as big and full as it wants? Here's what eventually happens with an indeterminate tomato left to its own devices. It turns into an enormous, sprawling mass of vines, and the plant's energy, which is a genuinely limited resource, not an infinite one, gets divided across dozens of competing growing points instead of concentrated into fewer, stronger fruit-producing branches. You end up with more tomatoes than you'd think, but most of them small, slow to ripen, and hidden so deep in foliage that pests and disease find them before you do. Those little shoots are called suckers, and here's the part almost nobody realizes. Each one has the potential to become an entirely new stem, with its own leaves, its own flowers, its own demand on the plant's root system and photosynthetic output. A tomato plant only has so much sugar being produced by photosynthesis at any given time. Every sucker you leave on the plant is another mouth at the dinner table, splitting that same limited supply. Most gardeners misunderstand this because pruning feels like it should hurt the plant, not help it. It feels wasteful to cut away healthy green growth. Here's the fix, and it takes about 5 minutes a week. For indeterminate varieties, pinch out suckers while they're still small. Using your fingers or clean pruning snips, focusing your effort on the lower third of the plant where airflow matters most. You don't need to remove every single one, leaving a few main stems, typically 2 or 3, gives you a plant that channels its energy into fewer, larger, faster ripening tomatoes instead of an overwhelming tangle. Determinate varieties like Roma generally need little to no suckering at all, so know which type you're growing before you start snipping. Now, everything we've covered so far protects the plant from itself. But this next mistake is different. It's the one where an outside threat exploits every other mistake we've already talked about, and it's the fastest moving danger on this entire list. Before we get into the last two, and trust me, you want to stick around for these, because mistake number 7 is the one that can take down a perfectly healthy tomato patch in a single humid week. I just want to take 30 seconds here. This channel exists for one simple reason. Gardening should come with fewer heartbreaks and more harvests. Every video here is built around the kind of lessons that usually take years of trial and error to learn on your own. If that's useful to you, subscribing just means you won't miss the next one when it lands. Alright, back to the garden. Mistake 6: watering the leaves instead of the soil at the end of a long day. It's second nature to grab the hose and spray the whole plant down, leaves, stems, everything, top to bottom. It feels thorough. It feels like you're giving the plant a good refreshing drink. But here's what eventually happens, especially in humid climates or during a stretch of overcast summer days. Those wet leaves stay wet long after you've walked away, sometimes overnight, and that's exactly the window fungal and bacterial diseases need to take hold. The science here connects directly back to what we covered with spacing. Fungal spores that cause early blight and late blight require a film of standing water on the leaf surface to germinate and infect the plant. Without that moisture, most spores simply can't get in. Overhead watering in the evening is essentially rolling out the red carpet, because the leaves don't get a chance to dry before nightfall, when temperatures drop and humidity rises even further. Most gardeners misunderstand this because watering the leaves feels more generous, more complete, somehow more caring than aiming low. But the roots are the only part of the plant actually absorbing that water anyway. Everything landing on the leaves is, at best, doing nothing, and at worst, setting up a disease outbreak. The fix: water at the base of the plant, right at soil level, ideally in the morning so any splashback that does happen has all day to dry. A soaker hose or drip line is the gold standard here, because it delivers water directly to the root zone without ever touching a leaf. If you're hand watering with a hose, just aim low and resist the urge to cool the whole plant off on a hot evening. That instinct, as kind as it feels, is often the very thing that invites the disease we're about to talk about next. Mistake 7: ignoring early disease signs because it's probably nothing. This is the one I promised you at the very beginning, the mistake that can undo every single thing we've talked about today in a matter of days. Here's what typically happens. You notice a few small dark spots on a lower leaf, maybe a slight yellowing around the edges. It's such a small thing on such a big, healthy-looking plant that most gardeners think, I'll deal with that later, or just pluck the one leaf off and move on with their day. And then, sometimes within 72 hours during a warm, humid stretch, that small thing has spread through half the plant. Within a week, it can jump to every tomato plant in the row. Here's why it moves that fast, and it's honestly one of the more dramatic things happening in your garden that you never see. Fungal diseases like blight reproduce through spores, and each infected spot on a leaf can release thousands of new spores, carried by wind, rain splash, or even your hands and tools as you move between plants. Under warm, humid conditions, a new generation of spores can form and spread within just a day or two. That's not a slow-moving problem. That's closer to exponential growth. Most gardeners misunderstand this because a couple of spots on one leaf just doesn't look like an emergency. It looks like nothing. But disease doesn't wait for you to feel worried before it spreads. Here's the fix, and it needs to become a habit, not a once-a-season chore. Walk your tomato patch every few days, and actually look, not glance. Look at the lower leaves, where disease almost always starts first. The moment you spot dark spots, yellowing rings, or leaves that look off in a way you can't quite explain, remove them immediately. Put them in the trash rather than the compost pile. And disinfect your pruning tools between plants with a simple diluted bleach or rubbing alcohol solution. Consider a preventative copper-based fungicide spray if you garden in a historically humid region, applied before symptoms even appear, since prevention is dramatically more effective than trying to treat an active outbreak. And whenever possible, choose disease-resistant varieties. Look for letters like V, F, N, or T after a tomato's name at the nursery, which signal built-in resistance to verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, nematodes, and tobacco mosaic virus. Catch it in the first 2 or 3 days, and you're removing a leaf. Wait a week, and you might be removing an entire plant or several. So here's what I want you to walk away with today. Every one of these 7 mistakes has the exact same thing in common. They don't look like mistakes while you're making them. They look like reasonable, careful, even generous choices: planting shallow because it looks tidy, watering the leaves because it feels thorough, letting the plant grow wild because more green feels like more life. The truth is, a great tomato harvest isn't about doing more. It's about understanding what the plant is actually asking for, underground and above it, and giving it exactly that, nothing more, nothing less. You now know something that took me years of trial, error, and more than a few sad, rotten tomatoes to figure out. Use it. Go check those lower leaves this week. Adjust that watering schedule. Give your plants room to breathe. If this saved you from a mistake you didn't know you were making, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you know another gardener who's been fighting the same losing battle with their tomatoes every summer, send this their way. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can hand someone isn't a tip. It's the reason behind it. Happy growing, and I'll see you in the next one.